At 19, Marcus inherited a tech empire worth $3 billion and the hardest job of his life, watching his father disappear one memory at a time. The man who built Amazon's first competitor from a two-car garage in Magnolia now stares at beige walls in that same house, unable to recognize his only son for 6 months running. The mahogany desk, where Robert once sketched server architectures on yellow legal pads, now holds pill bottles arranged in precise rows, color-coded by a medical team that changes every few weeks. Marcus has exactly 30 days to prove he can care for his father without destroying the company, or he loses controlling interest to a family that's been circling like vultures since the inheritance papers were signed at Bogle and Gates downtown. 3 professional caregivers have already walked out in 8 weeks. The first lasted 12 days before quitting via text message at 3 a.m., claiming Robert was too aggressive for standard protocols. The second made it 3 weeks before the agency pulled her after what they called medication compliance issues, code for Robert refusing to swallow pills that made him sleep 18 hours a day. The third caregiver, a cheerful woman named Beth, who spoke to Robert like he was 5 years old, lasted exactly 9 days before Robert threw his coffee mug at the kitchen wall and shouted words he hadn't used since his Navy days in 1968. The woman standing in the marble foyer on this grey Seattle morning doesn't look like the others. Where previous caregivers carried oversized canvas purses full of sedatives and laminated agency protocols, this one brings a weathered leather notebook that looks like it's survived actual use. She introduces herself as Claire Washington, RN, with 15 years in dementia care at Seattle Children's Hospital and zero tolerance for what she calls checkbook medicine. The assumption that expensive problems always require expensive solutions. Claire is 38, precise in her movements, wearing scrubs the color of Pacific Northwest evergreens instead of the clinical white that previous caregivers favored. When Marcus explains his father's episodes while leading her through the house, she asks questions that surprise him. What time do the episodes usually start? What's the lighting like in his room? Who else is in the house when he gets agitated? Has anyone tracked whether the episodes correlate with meals, medications, or changes in routine? Marcus realizes he doesn't know any of these things. The previous caregivers handled everything, while he managed board meetings and damage control with increasingly skeptical shareholders who whisper about leadership transitions during coffee breaks at the Columbia Tower Club. The house on Magnolia Avenue costs $42,000 a month to staff, not counting medical expenses, and the family's patience is measured in weeks, not months. Your father had 3 falls last month, Claire says, reviewing medical files spread across the dining room table where the family used to eat Sunday dinners before Robert stopped recognizing what a fork was for. The incident reports blame confusion, but confusion doesn't happen in a vacuum. When exactly did each fall occur? What was happening in the house? Who else was present? Her questions reveal gaps in care that Marcus never noticed. The previous caregivers documented everything that went wrong, but never asked why it went wrong in the first place. His father, Robert, built his fortune understanding systems and patterns, debugging code, until server networks hummed like well-tuned engines. The cruel irony is that Alzheimer's follows patterns too, but no one in the house learned to look for them. Robert's brain processes information the same way his damaged servers used to. Inputs and outputs still happen, but the connections fire in unexpected directions, creating results that make sense only if you understand the underlying logic. The madrasta, Linda, inherited 30% of the company when she married Robert 5 years ago in a ceremony at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel that Seattle Society pages covered with uncomfortable enthusiasm. She's been pushing for professional institutional care since the neurologist at University of Washington Medical Center confirmed the Alzheimer's diagnosis 8 months ago. Linda drives a white Range Rover and schedules her visits to the house around her yoga classes in Queen Anne, treating Robert's condition like an inconvenient disruption to her social calendar. Marcus's uncles, Jim and Paul, own another 20% between them and whisper about responsible leadership transitions during family dinners at restaurants where they can speak freely without Robert overhearing conversations he no longer understands anyway. They've been researching memory care facilities since Christmas, armed with brochures featuring smiling seniors in gardens that look nothing like the locked units where actual care happens. The family dynamics crystallized during Robert's last board meeting 3 months ago, when he forgot the name of the company he founded and called the CFO by his brother's name for 45 minutes straight. The video from that meeting, leaked to Seattle Times reporters, showed a man who looked exactly like the tech visionary Robert had always been, speaking with the same authoritative voice, making the same confident gestures, while saying words that connected to nothing at all. Claire starts her first evening shift at 6 p.m. sharp, just as Robert begins his nightly routine of calling for someone named Dorothy, his sister, who died in a car accident on Aurora Avenue in 1982, when Robert was 23 and still debugging systems by hand. Previous caregivers tried corrections. Dorothy isn't here, Mr. Harrison. Medications, Ativan dissolved in apple juice, and physical restraints, a lap belt that made Robert fight like he was drowning. Claire pulls out a small Bluetooth speaker from her leather bag, scrolls through a playlist on her iPhone that she's organized by decade, and plays My Way at just above whisper volume. The Frank Sinatra version, not the newer covers that sound close but miss the subtle timing that made the original stick in millions of memories. Robert stops mid-call, his shoulders relaxing like someone just turned off an alarm he didn't know was ringing. He doesn't speak, doesn't smile, doesn't show recognition, but he stops the desperate searching that usually lasts until the late news signs off at midnight. Music therapy? Claire explains when Marcus appears in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, confused by the unusual quiet. Procedural memory often survives longer than episodic memory in Alzheimer's patients. Your father probably heard this song thousands of times when his neural pathways were forming strong connections. High school, college, early career years. It's not magic, it's neuroplasticity. The brain finds alternate routes to access stored information. She shows him the leather notebook where she's begun tracking Robert's patterns with the methodical precision of a software debugger. Agitation peaks between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Appetite improves with finger foods he can manage independently, spatial awareness better in morning light than afternoon shadows when the house fills with confusing silhouettes. Each observation connects to potential interventions, creating a map of what works and what makes things worse. Marcus wants to dismiss her as another temporary fix, another well-meaning professional who'll discover that his father's condition defeats good intentions. But the house stays quiet that first night for the first time in weeks. The silence feels strange, almost suspicious, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. When Robert wakes at 2:17 a.m. confused about where he is, Claire doesn't argue with his reality or try to force him back to sleep with medication. Instead, she validates his feelings without reinforcing his confusion. "You seem worried about something," she says, sitting in the chair beside his bed instead of standing over him like authority figure. "Tell me what's on your mind." Robert explains that he's supposed to be somewhere else, that people are expecting him, that he's late for something important he can't quite remember. Claire listens like his concerns make perfect sense, then slowly redirects his attention to familiar objects in the room. The framed photo of his Navy service, the mahogany clock that belonged to his father, the view of Elliott Bay through windows he's looked through for 35 years. The technique works because it treats Robert's confusion as communication rather than defiance. He's not being difficult. He's trying to make sense of a world where his internal maps no longer match external reality. Claire's approach acknowledges his emotional truth while gently providing the context he needs to feel safe in his own bedroom. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. The second week brings family pressure that arrives in a white Range Rover at precisely 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. interrupting Claire's afternoon routine with Robert. Linda sweeps into the house wearing Lululemon athleisure and rolling her eyes at the classical music playlist coming from the living room speakers. "This is all very touching," Linda says, surveying the color-coded medication organizer and the daily schedule posted on the refrigerator like a middle school classroom. "But the board expects decisive action. Your father needs professional medical supervision, and you need to focus on what you inherited this company to do." Marcus has heard variations of this argument for months, delivered in coffee shops and conference rooms and family dinners where Robert's empty chair dominates every conversation. But watching Claire guide his father through a modified physical therapy session, simple arm raises that prevent muscle atrophy, weight shifts that maintain balance, range of motion exercises disguised as games, he realizes professional care isn't what his father has been getting. It's what he's getting for the first time since the diagnosis. Linda's frustration stems from costs that multiply every month without producing the kind of dramatic improvements that justify expense reports. Home care runs $45,000 monthly, not counting medications, medical equipment, and modifications to the house that insurance considers lifestyle choices rather than medical necessities. The memory care facilities Linda researched cost half that amount and provide what their brochures call comprehensive clinical oversight, a phrase that sounds reassuring until you visit and discover it means medication schedules designed to keep residents calm rather than functional. Claire documents everything in handwriting that looks like medical school training never quite left her muscle memory. Sleep duration measured in 15-minute increments, fluid intake tracked to the ounce, successful redirections noted alongside failed interventions. Her notebook becomes a diagnostic tool, a roadmap of what works and what doesn't, information no previous caregiver bothered collecting because agencies bill by the hour, not by the outcome. When Robert refuses his morning medications, Claire doesn't interpret refusal as defiance or cognitive decline. She identifies that he responds better to routine cues than verbal instructions, so she establishes a consistent sequence that treats his remaining autonomy with respect. Coffee first, served in the same blue mug he's used for 20 years, then medications presented alongside honey from the Pike Place market vendor he used to visit every Saturday morning. Then the morning news on King 5 at exactly the same volume he preferred when his hearing was better but his mind was still sharp. The breakthrough happens during week 3 on a Wednesday evening that should have been a crisis but becomes something else entirely. Robert becomes agitated during dinner, pushing away his plate of pot roast and demanding to go home while sitting at the kitchen table in the house he bought in 1987 with his first major software licensing deal. The episode follows a pattern that previous caregivers would have labeled sundown syndrome, requiring immediate pharmaceutical intervention. Claire recognizes it as something more specific, a response to the particular combination of fluorescent kitchen lighting and the sound of the garbage disposal running during cleanup, environmental triggers that create disorientation in a brain struggling to process sensory information. The garbage disposal sounds like machinery Robert used to understand, but now it registers as threatening noise without context. The fluorescent lights flicker at a frequency that his damaged visual processing interprets as movement when nothing is actually moving. She dims the lights, moves dinner to the living room where table lamps create softer shadows, and puts on a Seahawks game from 1995 when the team still played in the Kingdom and Robert's memories were still forming clearly. The voices of announcers he recognizes, calling plays he remembers, create a sonic environment where his brain can relax instead of fighting to make sense of unfamiliar stimuli. Robert settles immediately, but more than that, he starts commenting on the game. "That's Dan Maguire," he says, pointing at the television, threw interceptions like he was trying to set records. The commentary continues for 20 minutes. using names of players he hasn't mentioned in months, discussing strategies that require complex memory connections. The recall isn't perfect. He thinks the game is happening live, confuses some years, mixes up some statistics, but it's functional memory, accessible and coherent and unmistakably his own. Marcus realizes he's been hiding from his father's condition, treating it like a business problem that requires purchasing the right solution rather than understanding the underlying system. The night he decides to truly comprehend what Claire does, he pretends to sleep on the living room couch, positioned where he can observe the overnight shift without being obvious about his surveillance. He expects to catch her cutting corners, watching Netflix on company time, or taking phone calls that prove divided attention. Instead, he witnesses something that changes his understanding of what professional competence actually looks like. At 2:47 a.m., Robert wakes up calling for his mother, who died of cancer when he was 12 years old and still believed that adults had answers for everything. He's not confused about time in the way Marcus initially assumes. He's accessing a specific memory from 1963, complete and vivid and emotionally real to him in that moment. Claire doesn't correct the timeline or try to drag him back to present reality. She sits beside his bed and asks about his mother with the same interest she might show a colleague describing a recent vacation. Robert describes his mother's voice reading him stories, her hands teaching him to tie shoes, the way she made pancakes on Sunday mornings with faces made from blueberries, a ritual that turned breakfast into theater for an audience of one. For 20 minutes, he's not a man losing his mind to a disease that steals identity piece by piece. He's a 12-year-old boy missing his mother, and Claire treats him with the dignity that grief deserves regardless of when or why it surfaces. The conversation doesn't cure anything or restore lost function, but it honors the person Robert still is underneath the symptoms that obscure him from view. When the memory fades and Robert realizes he doesn't recognize where he is or why he's awake in the middle of the night, Claire doesn't rush to reorient him with facts he can't retain. She acknowledges his fear like it makes perfect sense, validates his confusion as a normal response to disorienting circumstances, and then slowly, gently, provides just enough context to help him find his way back to the present without feeling like he failed some test he didn't know he was taking. Marcus stops pretending to sleep and asks the question that's been building for 3 weeks. "How did you know to do that?" Claire explains that behavior always has a reason, especially in dementia care, even when the behavior seems random or destructive. Agitation usually signals unmet needs that patients can't articulate directly. Physical discomfort, emotional distress, environmental confusion, boredom, fear, or simply the human need to feel useful and respected. "Your father isn't broken," she says, keeping her voice low so Robert can sleep undisturbed. "His communication system is damaged, but the person underneath is still there. The disease affects how he expresses himself and how he processes information, but it doesn't erase who he is. There's a difference between losing your mind and losing access to your mind. The goal isn't to fix him, it's to find ways to connect with who he still is." The family crisis arrives in week 4, triggered by a routine call from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Robert's neurologist at University of Washington Medical Center. The doctor reports something unprecedented in Robert's case. His condition has stabilized rather than declined for the first time in 8 months. The mini mental state examination shows slight improvements in some areas, particularly recognition of familiar objects and response to environmental cues. Linda interprets this news as proof that expensive home care produces diminishing returns. "He's not getting better," she tells Marcus over lunch at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, the same dining room where she married Robert when his net worth was still measured in millions rather than billions. "Stabilized means not worse, not recovered." This caregiver is costing us $45,000 a month, and the institutional options we've researched provide round-the-clock medical supervision for $23,000, including medications and physical therapy. The math makes sense until Marcus considers what those numbers actually represent. Institutional care focuses on safety and medical compliance rather than quality of life or cognitive stimulation. Residents receive excellent medical monitoring and terrible emotional care, spending their days in common rooms, watching television programs they don't understand, eating meals they don't recognize, surrounded by staff trained to manage symptoms rather than engage with the people experiencing them. That evening, Marcus asks Claire to teach him her documentation system, partly because he wants to understand her methods, and partly because he needs evidence to present to a family that measures success in spreadsheets rather than stories. She shows him how to recognize pre-agitation signals that occur 15 to 20 minutes before behavioral episodes, increased pacing between rooms, repetitive touching of objects like door handles or picture frames, changes in vocal tone that indicate rising anxiety before it becomes visible agitation. If you can identify the trigger before the behavior escalates, Claire explains, while reviewing 3 weeks of data, intervention becomes redirection instead of crisis management. It's the difference between preventing a house fire and calling the fire department after the house is already burning. Both approaches work, but one preserves more of what you're trying to protect. The lesson proves itself 2 days later, during a family dinner designed to demonstrate Robert's continuing decline to visiting relatives who drive up from Portland in Uncle Jim's Lexus SUV. Jim and Paul arrive with their wives, filling the house with unfamiliar voices and disrupted routines that Robert's damaged brain interprets as potential threats requiring constant vigilance. Claire identifies the environmental stressors before Robert does. Too many people talking simultaneously, overlapping conversations that create acoustic confusion, changes to furniture placement that disrupt his spatial navigation, unfamiliar perfumes and colognes that overload his sensory processing. She quietly suggests modifications that sound minor but create major differences. Smaller group conversations instead of everyone talking at once, familiar music playing in the background at just above whisper volume. Robert seated in his usual chair at the head of the table, facing the window where he can see Elliott Bay and the ferry boats he's watched for 35 years. The dinner succeeds in ways no one expects. Robert participates in conversation, recognizes his brothers despite not having seen them for 6 months, and even makes a joke about the Seahawks draft picks that demonstrates both memory recall and social awareness. He doesn't remember their names consistently and sometimes confuses which brother is which, but he engages with them as familiar people rather than strangers who happen to know his name. The relatives leave confused about why they'd been summoned to witness deterioration that never materialized. Uncle Paul privately asks Marcus if Robert is being over-medicated to appear more functional than he actually is, suspecting performance enhancement rather than recognizing that appropriate care produces genuine improvements. Linda accuses Claire of overstimulating Robert with artificial social situations and warns that the apparent progress won't survive the stress of maintaining appearances. She's wrong, and Marcus can prove it with numbers that tell a story about specialized care delivering results that institutional settings rarely achieve. Claire's notebook contains 4 weeks of data showing measurable improvements across multiple categories. Nighttime agitation episodes down from 7 per week to 2. Daytime confusion incidents reduced by 60%. Successful meal completion up from 40% to 85%. Hours of sleep increased from 4 broken hours to 6 continuous hours. If this moment hit you, tap like. It helps more people find these stories. The improvements aren't miraculous recoveries that reverse disease progression, but they represent something more valuable: sustained quality of life that lets Robert remain himself instead of becoming a collection of symptoms that require management. The data proves that competent care produces measurable outcomes, even in conditions that insurance companies classify as terminal decline, requiring only comfort measures and pharmaceutical sedation. The board meeting arrives on exactly day 30, scheduled for 9 a.m. in the conference room on the 42nd floor of Columbia Center, where floor-to-ceiling windows frame views of Mount Rainier and Puget Sound that Robert used to enjoy during the quarterly meetings he ran for 15 years. Marcus walks into the room carrying Claire's documentation, 3 weeks of video evidence showing his father's daily routines, and a proposal that surprises everyone, including himself. Instead of defending his caregiving choices as personal family decisions, he presents them as a scalable business model that addresses problems affecting the company's workforce and competitive positioning. The average cost of memory care facilities in Seattle runs $68,000 annually per patient, Marcus begins, clicking through PowerPoint slides he prepared at 3 a.m. with the methodical precision his father taught him, with outcomes that include increased behavioral problems, faster cognitive decline, higher medication costs, and family satisfaction rates below 40%. The boardroom fills with 12 people who expected to discuss Marcus's fitness for leadership, not analyze healthcare economics. Linda shifts uncomfortably in her chair, realizing the meeting isn't proceeding according to the script she rehearsed. Uncle Jim checks his phone, confused about why a family intervention has become a business presentation complete with charts and cost analyses. Our home care model costs $54,000 annually per patient and delivers measurable quality of life improvements, along with family satisfaction approaching 90%. Marcus continues, presenting Claire's data as evidence rather than anecdote. The difference isn't just personal preference, it's a systemic failure that we have the opportunity to address through better resource allocation and outcome-focused protocols. Linda objects that the board isn't in the healthcare business and shouldn't be making decisions based on one family's experience with a single caregiver. Marcus has prepared for this objection with research that expands beyond his father's case. We're in the technology business, but our employees are human beings with aging parents and complex family responsibilities. The current healthcare system fails them expensively and predictably. We have the resources and expertise to develop solutions that work better. The PowerPoint presentation includes Claire's documentation, testimonials from Dr. Chen and the family physician, cost comparisons with institutional care, and projections for scaling individualized care models across employee populations. More importantly, for a room full of executives who measure success in quarterly returns, it includes Marcus's analysis of how employee productivity correlates with family care stress and how companies that provide comprehensive support retain talent more effectively than those offering standard benefit packages. Competence isn't something you inherit, Marcus tells the boardroom full of people who've watched him struggle with responsibilities he never asked for. It's something you develop by paying attention to people who know more than you do and learning from their expertise instead of trying to purchase solutions that don't address underlying problems. I learned more about leadership in 30 days of watching Claire work than in 18 months of running board meetings. The admission surprises everyone, including Marcus himself. For the first time since inheriting the company, he's not defending his qualifications or apologizing for his inexperience. He's presenting evidence of growth, demonstrating that good leadership means recognizing expertise wherever you find it and creating systems that let competence triumph over credentials, connections, and inherited authority. The vote isn't even close. Marcus retains controlling interest by a margin of 9-3, with only Linda and the two uncles dissenting. The board approves a pilot program offering comprehensive family care support to company employees, funded through existing benefits budgets reallocated from less effective programs. Linda's attempt to prove leadership incompetence instead demonstrates exactly the opposite, that real leadership means admitting what you don't know and learning from people whose expertise you can't buy or inherit. The Employee Family Care Program launches 3 months later with a waiting list of 47 families and initial funding of $1.8 million annually. Claire directs a team of 8 caregivers, all trained in her documentation methods and individualized intervention techniques. The program costs less than traditional institutional care while delivering measurably better outcomes for patients and families who previously had no good options. 6 months after that first quiet night when My Way played softly through Bluetooth speakers, Marcus stands in the same Magnolia house watching his father work on a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle of the Space Needle with Claire's patient guidance. Robert completes maybe 20% of the pieces independently, but that's 20% more than anyone expected 6 months ago, when 3 different doctors used phrases like rapid decline and end-stage progression. Robert still doesn't recognize Marcus consistently. Some days, he's a familiar stranger. Other days, he's the boy who used to help with yard work on weekends. Occasionally, he's Robert's own father, returned from decades of death to visit unexpectedly. But the daily routine includes moments of genuine connection that medication and institutional care never provided, conversations that honor who Robert still is, rather than mourning who he used to be. The house on Magnolia Avenue stays quiet most nights now, filled with the comfortable sounds of successful routine rather than the crisis management that dominated the months before Claire arrived. Robert sleeps 6 hours continuously, falls maybe once a month instead of once a week, and maintains enough functional independence to feed himself finger foods, choose between 2 shirt options, and express clear preferences about daily activities, like whether to sit by the window or watch television. The memory loss continues because Alzheimer's doesn't reverse its damage. Robert will never again debug server networks or negotiate licensing deals or recognize his son every morning. But the quality of his remaining life improves measurably and consistently, preserved by techniques that treat dignity as a medical intervention rather than a luxury that disease victims can't afford. On Sunday mornings, when Seattle fog rolls in from Puget Sound and the house fills with the soft light that Robert always loved best, Marcus sometimes finds his father humming My Way while looking out at the water traffic between Seattle and Bainbridge Island. Robert doesn't remember building the company that made the view possible, doesn't recognize the son who inherited it, but the song brings him peace that lasts hours instead of minutes. Claire taught Marcus that peace in dementia care counts as victory, not cure, not recovery, not restoration of lost function, but the preservation of human dignity in circumstances that strip away everything except the essential self that survives underneath symptoms and statistics. Share your take in the comments. What felt like the turning point for you? The corporate headquarters now includes a family care resource center on the 3rd floor, where employees can access the same expertise that prevented Marcus's family from making decisions based on fear instead of information. The center provides care coordination, caregiver training, family education, and emergency support services that help working people manage elder care without choosing between career advancement and family responsibility. Linda moved to Scottsdale 6 months after the board meeting, selling her shares at market value and buying a condo near her sister, who promised that Arizona sunshine would cure everything that Seattle rain had made worse. She sends Christmas cards with photos of desert landscapes and updates about yoga teacher training that Marcus reads politely and files in the same drawer where he keeps Claire's original notebook. The uncles remain involved in company operations, but no longer question Marcus's leadership capacity or suggest that inherited wealth qualifies them to make medical decisions for family members they visit twice a year. Uncle Jim now calls monthly to ask about Robert's condition, and occasionally mentions that his own father-in-law might benefit from the kind of individualized care that produces such obvious improvements. Real leadership, Marcus discovered, isn't about having all the answers or making decisions that everyone agrees with or inheriting enough money to purchase solutions for problems you don't understand. It's about recognizing the people who do have answers, learning from their expertise without feeling threatened by their competence, and creating systems that let knowledge triumph over privilege when the stakes matter more than ego. Marcus inherited a fortune worth $3 billion and a company that employs 8,000 people, but he earned something more valuable: the understanding that dignity, properly applied, can slow time's cruelest thefts. Not stop them, not reverse them, but slow them enough to preserve what matters most about the people we love while they're still here to love. The morning routine continues 7 days a week with the reliability of sunrise and tide schedules. Coffee served in the blue mug at exactly 8 a.m., medications presented with honey from Pike Place Market, morning news on King 5, at the same comfortable volume that doesn't strain Robert's hearing or overwhelm his processing capacity. Robert still asks for Dorothy sometimes, still gets confused about what year it is or why he can't find his car keys that Claire quietly moved to prevent him from attempting to drive. But the panic that once consumed entire days now lasts minutes instead of hours, managed by techniques that treat confusion as communication rather than defiance. When Robert wakes up frightened because he doesn't recognize his bedroom, Claire validates his fear as completely reasonable, then gently provides context that helps him feel safe without making him feel stupid for being confused. Marcus keeps Claire's original leather notebook in his desk drawer at the Columbia Center office, a reminder that the most important business lesson he ever learned had nothing to do with quarterly earnings, market share, or competitive positioning. When reporters ask about the family care program's success metrics, he quotes numbers about cost savings and employee satisfaction ratings that make the initiative sound like smart fiscal policy rather than personal experience. But the real measure is simpler and harder to quantify: the sound of his father's laughter during a Seahawks game, clear and present and unmistakably his own, echoing through a house that finally feels like home again instead of a medical facility disguised as a residence. The laughter doesn't happen every day, doesn't last long when it comes, but it proves that Robert is still there, underneath the disease that obscures him from view, still capable of joy when the circumstances align properly. That's what Claire taught Marcus to recognize, not the absence of problems, but the presence of a person worth preserving. The distinction matters more than all the money he inherited, more than the company he's learning to run, more than the board meetings where he's finally earned the right to make decisions that no one questions. In a world that measures success by acquisition and growth, Marcus learned to value what can't be bought or sold or inherited, the knowledge that competence applied with compassion can create dignity where none existed before.